Sometimes, life presents us with a choice, a single moment where doing the right thing could cost you everything. But in those moments, we discover who we really are. This is the story of Clara Mitchell, an ordinary woman with extraordinary courage. She was just a receptionist at a luxurious hotel, trying to make ends meet in the bustling city of New York. But one fateful night, when faced with injustice, Clara made a decision that would not only change her life but ignite a movement. What started as a simple act of kindness soon unraveled into a journey filled with challenges, unexpected allies, and life-changing opportunities. Clara's story reminds us that it's not where you come from or what you have, it's the choices you make and the values you hold that define your legacy. So sit back, and let me take you on a journey of courage, compassion, and the ripple effects of standing up for what's right. This is more than just Clara's story, it's a lesson for all of us. It was an ordinary evening at the Grand Ascendancy Hotel, a 5-star establishment nestled in the heart of New York City. Clara Mitchell, a 27-year-old receptionist, stood at the polished mahogany counter, her uniform pristine and her smile professional yet distant. Beneath the polished veneer of her customer service facade, Clara carried a weight she could barely manage. Once a bright-eyed dreamer with ambitions of becoming a teacher, she now worked endless shifts, eking out a living in a city that often felt as if it were conspiring against her. Clara's story wasn't unique. Raised in a modest Midwestern town, she had been the first in her family to attend college, armed with a degree in education and a heart full of aspirations. She had moved to New York, hoping to land a teaching job, but life wasn't as kind as her childhood dreams had promised. Without connections or money to navigate the bureaucratic world of education, her applications were either ignored or rejected. Financial pressures mounted, and she found herself forced to shelve her aspirations, taking a job at the hotel to survive. The Grand Ascendancy was a glittering microcosm of society's elite, a revolving door for CEOs, celebrities, and the ultra-wealthy. To Clara, it was a world she didn't belong to, a world she served but never participated in. Behind her polite demeanor, she harbored a growing bitterness toward the opulence she saw daily, a sharp contrast to her cramped studio apartment and the mountain of overdue bills she faced each month. That night, the hotel was hosting one of its grandest galas. The lobby buzzed with activity, the marble floors gleaming under the massive crystal chandelier. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in exquisite evening gowns filled the space, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of a live orchestra. Clara had spent the past hour directing guests to the ballroom, where champagne flowed freely and conversations revolved around art, politics, and business. Then, amidst the glamour, a ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Clara looked up from her station and saw the source of the disturbance. An elderly man had wandered in through the grand revolving doors. His clothes were shabby, his shoes worn, and he carried a tattered canvas bag slung over one shoulder. His grey hair was unkempt, and his lined face bore the weariness of a life lived on the fringes. The man's presence was like a blemish on the hotel's immaculate image. Conversations quieted, and heads turned, some with curiosity, others with disdain. Security guards hesitated, unsure whether to act. Clara felt her heart clench. She knew how quickly judgment could fall on someone who didn't fit into the carefully curated image of this place. From across the room, Richard Caldwell, a prominent businessman and a frequent guest at the hotel, broke the silence. His voice, loud and cutting, echoed through the lobby. "What's this?" he sneered. "An old vagrant wandering in? This is a disgrace. Where's management? Who's letting this happen?" Clara's hands tightened on the edge of the counter. She could see the elderly man freeze under Caldwell's words, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his bag. Clara glanced around, expecting someone, anyone, to intervene. But her colleagues avoided her gaze, pretending to be preoccupied. Even the hotel manager stood rooted in place, caught between pleasing an influential guest and upholding the hotel's reputation. Clara knew she had no real authority, but something inside her snapped. She couldn't stand by and let this man be humiliated. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward the commotion. Her heels clicked against the marble, drawing all eyes to her. "Excuse me, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice steady but her pulse racing. "This man is a guest in our lobby, and we treat all guests with respect here." Caldwell turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "You're defending him? A nobody? Do you know who you're speaking to, young lady?" Clara felt the weight of his authority pressing down on her, but she refused to back down. "I do, sir, and I also know that no one deserves to be treated this way, no matter their appearance." The room was silent again, save for the distant hum of the orchestra. Caldwell smirked, a condescending expression that made Clara's stomach churn. "Well, if you're so concerned, why don't you invite him to the gala? I'm sure he'll fit right in," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Clara stood her ground. "I'm not inviting him anywhere, Mr. Caldwell, but I won't allow him to be humiliated either." Her manager, Mr. Perry, hurried over, his face pale. "Clara, step back," he hissed. "You're making a scene." "No, Mr. Perry," Clara said, her voice growing firmer. "The scene was made when Mr. Caldwell decided this man didn't belong." Perry's jaw tightened. "You're out of line," he said. "Go back to your station." Clara hesitated. She knew defying her manager could cost her the job she desperately needed. But then her eyes met the elderly man's. In his gaze, she saw a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. It was enough to steel her resolve. "I'm sorry, Mr. Perry," she said, "but I can't do that." The guards finally moved forward, ushering the man gently toward the doors. Before he left, he turned to Clara and whispered, "Thank you, miss. Not many would have done what you did." Clara's manager wasted no time. As soon as the lobby returned to its polished normalcy, he handed her a termination notice. "You've disgraced this hotel," he said coldly. "Pack your things and leave." Clara's heart sank, but she didn't regret her actions. As she walked out of the hotel for the last time, she felt strangely liberated. She had lost her job, but she had stood up for what she believed in. She didn't know that this decision would set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. The next morning, Clara Mitchell awoke to the shrill sound of her alarm clock echoing through her tiny studio apartment. Her first thought was a grim reminder: she no longer had a job. As the realization settled in, she stared at the cracked ceiling, wondering how she was going to make rent, let alone navigate the days ahead. The previous night played on a loop in her mind, the confrontation with Richard Caldwell, the elderly man's quiet gratitude, and her manager's cold dismissal. Despite everything, she felt an odd sense of peace. For once, she had done something that felt unequivocally right, even if the consequences were severe. Dragging herself out of bed, Clara shuffled to the window. The city below was as chaotic as ever. The constant hum of traffic and distant sirens a stark contrast to the quiet stillness of her apartment. Her stomach growled, but the thought of eating felt trivial. Instead, she reached for her laptop, intending to scour job boards, when a sharp knock at her door startled her. She froze. Visitors were rare, and given her current state, the unexpected sound sent her heart racing. Slowly, she approached the door and peeked through the peephole. To her astonishment, a sleek black car was parked outside the building. Standing at her door was a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. His expression was calm yet purposeful. "Miss Mitchell," he called out, his voice steady but polite. "My name is James Whittaker. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Walter Grayson." Clara hesitated. The name was unfamiliar, and the presence of someone so polished felt almost surreal in her dingy apartment building. "What is this about?" she asked through the door, her voice wary. "Mr. Grayson would like to speak with you personally," James replied. "He has sent me to escort you to his residence." Clara's mind raced. Walter Grayson? The name sounded vaguely familiar, like something she had read in a headline but couldn't quite place. "Why would someone like Mr. Grayson want to meet me?" she asked skeptically. James smiled faintly. "I believe it has to do with your actions last night." Her heart skipped a beat. "The hotel? The old man?" she murmured, more to herself than to James. Before she could overthink it, curiosity got the better of her. "Give me a moment," she said, closing the door to gather her thoughts. throwing on a clean blouse and brushing her hair. Clara tried to shake off the creeping anxiety. She didn't trust this situation entirely, but there was something about James's demeanor that suggested sincerity. A part of her, the part that had been yearning for a break, urged her to take a chance. When she opened the door again, James gestured toward the waiting car. "Whenever you're ready, Miss Mitchell." The ride through the city was unnervingly quiet. Clara sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. James, seated across from her, seemed unbothered by the silence, his focus on the tablet in his hands. As the car weaved through traffic, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet fathom. After nearly an hour, the car entered a secluded neighborhood lined with sprawling estates. Finally, it pulled up to an ornate wrought iron gate. Beyond it was a vast property, its centerpiece a grand mansion that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a movie. The car came to a smooth stop, and James stepped out, opening the door for Clara. As she stepped onto the cobblestone driveway, her breath hitched. The mansion was even more impressive up close, with its ivy-covered walls and towering windows. James led her inside, where a butler greeted them and guided her to a sunlit sitting room. The walls were adorned with artwork, and the air carried the faint scent of lavender. Seated in a high-backed armchair near the fireplace was the elderly man from the hotel. But this time, he was unrecognizable from the figure she had defended the previous night. Dressed in a tailored three-piece suit, his posture was regal, and his eyes, though kind, held a piercing intelligence. "Miss Mitchell," he said, rising slowly to his feet. "I'm so glad you accepted my invitation." Clara's mouth went dry. "Mr. Grayson?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled warmly. "Yes, Walter Grayson. Please, sit, we have much to discuss." As she took a seat across from him, the pieces began to click into place. Walter Grayson was a name she had heard often in the media, one of the wealthiest philanthropists in the country, known for his advocacy for marginalized communities. But why had he been disguised as a homeless man? "I imagine you have many questions," Grayson began, folding his hands in his lap. "Allow me to explain. Last night was part of a personal experiment. I wanted to see how people would react to someone they perceived as destitute." Clara frowned. "Why would you do that?" Grayson's expression turned serious. "Because I believe that kindness, true kindness, is rare. Society has become increasingly indifferent to the struggles of others, and I wanted to understand that indifference firsthand." "What I didn't expect," he said, his gaze meeting hers, "was someone like you." Clara shifted uncomfortably. "I was just doing what I thought was right." "Precisely," Grayson said, his tone insistent. "You stood up for a stranger, knowing it could cost you everything. That kind of courage and compassion is what this world desperately needs." She didn't know how to respond. The weight of his words felt overwhelming, and a part of her wondered if she was being overly glorified for what had felt like a small act. Grayson continued, "I want to offer you an opportunity. Miss Mitchell, I'm launching a new initiative to combat systemic inequities, and I need someone with your integrity to help lead it." Clara blinked. "Me? I'm not qualified for something like that. I was a receptionist, not an activist." Grayson chuckled. "Leadership isn't about titles or degrees. It's about values, and you've already proven you have those in abundance. The rest, you can learn." Before she could respond, James re-entered the room, carrying a leather-bound portfolio. He handed it to Clara. Inside were documents detailing the initiative, a comprehensive plan to address homelessness, support underfunded schools, and provide resources for struggling families. "This is incredible," Clara murmured, flipping through the pages. But doubt lingered. "What if I fail?" Grayson's gaze softened. "Failure is part of the journey, Miss Mitchell, but the only true failure is not trying at all." For a long moment, Clara stared at the documents, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought about her life up until this point, her lost dreams, her struggles, and the moment at the hotel that had set all of this in motion. Could she really step into a role like this? Did she have the strength to make a difference? Finally, she looked up. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do it." Grayson's face broke into a smile. "Excellent. Welcome aboard, Miss Mitchell. I have a feeling this is the beginning of something extraordinary." Clara Mitchell's new life began the very next morning, marked by a swift departure from her cramped studio apartment to Walter Grayson's sprawling estate. She hadn't yet fully grasped the magnitude of her decision, but as she stood in the mansion's grand study, surrounded by bookshelves that seemed to touch the ceiling, the weight of her new responsibilities settled on her shoulders. Grayson wasted no time. Over the next several weeks, Clara was immersed in a rigorous crash course. She was introduced to the intricacies of non-profit management, social policy, and public relations. Each day started with hours of reading, followed by discussions with Grayson, who proved to be an inexhaustible well of wisdom. "Clara," he said one afternoon, handing her a stack of reports, "change is like a river carving through stone. It doesn't happen quickly or without effort, but persistence always triumphs." Despite his encouragement, Clara often felt out of her depth. Her first major task was organizing a pilot program to provide temporary housing and employment opportunities for homeless individuals. The initiative, dubbed the Hearth Project, was ambitious and required collaboration with city officials, business leaders, and community organizations. For someone who had once struggled to even negotiate her own rent, the scope was overwhelming. The Hearth Project's launch was set for a press conference at a local community center. Clara spent days preparing her speech, practicing in front of a mirror until her voice was hoarse. On the morning of the event, she stood in front of a modest crowd of reporters, cameras flashing in her face. Her palms were slick with sweat as she stepped up to the podium. "Good morning," she began, her voice quivering slightly. "Today marks the beginning of an initiative that aims to restore dignity and opportunity to those who have been overlooked for too long." As she spoke, her nerves began to settle. She recounted stories of individuals she had met in shelters, their struggles and resilience. She emphasized the importance of community involvement, calling on businesses and citizens alike to support the program. The applause that followed was modest but genuine. As Clara stepped away from the podium, Grayson, standing in the wings, gave her an approving nod. "You did well," he said, "but remember, the real work begins now." The Hearth Project was not without its detractors. A week after the press conference, Clara received an anonymous email filled with veiled threats. "Stop meddling where you don't belong." It read, "You have no idea who you're up against." Shaken but determined, Clara showed the email to Grayson. He read it calmly, then folded the paper and placed it on his desk. "This is what happens when you challenge the status quo," he said. "Fear is a weapon, Clara. Don't let it be used against you." But the threats weren't the only obstacles. City officials, pressured by influential property developers, dragged their feet on approving permits for the program's housing sites. Clara spent hours in tense meetings. Her arguments often met with condescension. At one particularly frustrating meeting, a councilman sneered, "What does a former hotel receptionist know about solving homelessness?" Clara's face burned with humiliation, but she refused to back down. "I know enough to see that doing nothing isn't working," she shot back, "and I know that if we don't act now, the problem will only get worse." Despite the setbacks, Clara found allies in unexpected places. Local business owners began donating supplies, and volunteers stepped forward to help renovate old buildings into temporary shelters. One night, as Clara visited a nearly finished site, she met an older woman named Mary, who had been living on the streets for years. "This place," Mary said, running her hand along the freshly painted wall. "It's the first time in a long while I've felt like I could call somewhere home." Those words renewed Clara's resolve. She worked tirelessly, often staying up late into the night, reviewing budgets and drafting proposals. Slowly but surely, the Hearth Project began to take shape. Just as the project was gaining momentum, disaster struck. A scathing article appeared in a major newspaper, accusing the Hearth Project of financial mismanagement. The allegations were baseless but damaging. Donations dried up, and public support wavered. Clara was devastated. She stormed into Grayson's study, the article clenched in her hand. "This could ruin everything," she exclaimed. "Grayson," ever composed, gestured for her to sit. Clara, the truth always comes out in the end, but only if you fight for it. Taking his advice, Clara organized a press briefing, armed with financial records that refuted the accusations. Standing before the cameras, she addressed the issue head-on. These claims are not only false but a distraction from the real issue, helping those in need. We will not be deterred. Her transparency won back much of the public's trust. But the experience left her shaken. Why would someone go to such lengths to sabotage us? She asked Grayson later. Because, he said, your success threatens their comfort. Months later, the Hearth Project opened its first housing site. The event was attended by community members, volunteers, and even some skeptical city officials. As Clara cut the ceremonial ribbon, she felt a surge of pride. The project was far from perfect, but it was a start. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Clara found Grayson sitting alone in his study. He looked frailer than usual, his once strong voice now soft. "Clara," he said, "you've done more than I could have ever hoped." Alarmed by his tone, she asked, "Are you feeling all right?" He smiled weakly. "I'm proud of you, and I'm at peace knowing the work will continue. Even when I'm gone." Clara's chest tightened. "Don't say that. We still have so much to do." "Yes," he agreed, "and you will do it. But my part in this is coming to an end." Days later, Grayson passed away, leaving Clara to grapple with her grief. In his will, he left her not only his estate but the full resources of his foundation. Along with the inheritance came a letter, written in his meticulous handwriting. "Clara, you are the torchbearer now. The path will be difficult. But remember, even the smallest light can guide others through the darkness." With renewed determination, Clara expanded the Hearth Project into a nationwide initiative. She faced opposition at every turn, from smear campaigns to political interference. But each challenge only strengthened her resolve. Her journey was far from over. But as she stood before a gathering of supporters years later, she reflected on how far she had come. The Hearth Project had grown into a movement, its reach extending to countless communities. And though Clara often felt the weight of her responsibilities, she carried Grayson's words with her. Change is like a river carving through stone. It doesn't happen quickly, but it always happens. Clara Mitchell, once a hotel receptionist with little more than her principles, had become a beacon of hope. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: she would never stop fighting for a world where no one was left behind. Life lessons from Clara's story. Life often tests us in ways we least expect. Clara's story is a poignant reminder of how small, courageous acts can set into motion events that not only reshape our lives but also ripple outward to create a better world. As we reflect on her journey, here are a few lessons we can take to heart. 1. Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Clara's defining moment came when she chose to defend someone who was being treated unfairly. Even though it meant risking everything she had, doing the right thing often requires us to step outside our comfort zones, face opposition, and sometimes endure losses. But in the end, standing up for what's right is always worth it, not just for others, but for our own sense of integrity. 2. Kindness is a quiet strength. In a world that often values power and success, kindness can seem small, even naive. But Clara's story shows that genuine kindness, paired with courage, has the power to break barriers, inspire others, and create meaningful change. Never underestimate the impact of treating others with dignity and respect. 3. Failure is part of growth. Clara faced setbacks, criticisms, and moments of self-doubt. But instead of giving up, she used those challenges to learn and grow. Life isn't about avoiding failure. It's about how we rise after we fall. Each mistake or obstacle is a stepping stone towards something greater. 4. True leadership is rooted in values. You don't need a title or a prestigious resume to lead. Clara began her journey as an ordinary woman, guided by her principles. True leadership isn't about status, it's about staying grounded in what you believe and using your voice to uplift others. 5. Change starts with one person. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of big problems. But Clara's journey reminds us that change always starts small. Whether it's helping one person, starting one conversation, or challenging one injustice, those small actions can grow into movements that transform lives. 6. Legacy is measured in impact. Walter Grayson's influence didn't end with his passing, it continued through Clara and the lives they touched together. We often think of legacy as something material, but the greatest legacies are the ones that inspire and empower others to carry the torch forward. A gentle call to action. Clara's story may be fictional, but its message is real. It's a challenge to each of us to look beyond our own circumstances and ask, how can I make a difference? You don't have to start a foundation or lead a movement. Sometimes, the most powerful changes come from the smallest acts, a kind word, a helping hand, or a willingness to stand up when others remain silent. Because in those moments, we're not just changing someone else's world, we're also shaping our own. So as you go about your day, remember this: every choice you make is an opportunity to leave the world just a little better than you found it. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful way to live.